On the pod today, the policy director for the progressive think tank New Consensus and one of the architects of the Green New Deal, Rhiana Gunn-Wright. Rhiana, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you. So I want to start with the context for the Green New Deal. Because the media is the media, they tend to frame the context as political and ideological, right? So, the Republican Party moves far to the right under Trump, and as a response, because politics is so polarized, Democrats are moving further to the left and proposing things like, Medicare for all and a Green New Deal. But it seems to me there's a different context for why the Green New Deal is so ambitious. Can you talk about that context and talk about why this plan is so different than climate groups may have proposed, just a few years ago under Obama?
Yeah, I think actually the context of that question sort of points out why it's different. We didn't move to the left because of Republicans. We are trying to address the issues that people are clamoring about and saying that they're facing and that they are facing in real life, which is wage stagnation, income inequality, environmental degradation, right, Medicare for all.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the reason why the Green New Deal is so comprehensive is a couple things. One, it's based on sort of a mass mobilization, it is based on a mass mobilization industrial policy approach to how to deal with climate. And that has to do very much with the fact that we have such a short timeline, and we have to bring down emissions so dramatically, which means that we have to throw everything. We have to essentially throw the full might of the country behind this problem if we're going to solve it. And then so that sort of transformation requires different policies in order for you to be able to pay for it, quote unquote, with real resources in terms of workers and physical capital. Often we talk about paying for it when we always actually mean financing it.
Right.
But you actually, for mobilization this big, you are trying to get to full employment, largely because you will probably need all of that. And so we have to sort of have a labor market where people can move around, where there's a safety net, where there's like a simple entry point for people, a ton of people, right? The labor participation for working adults is lower now than it was a decade ago.
Yeah.
And so you have all these people that have fallen out of the labor market that you have to plug back in. And so you need a streamlined workforce development like skills training, which we don't have. And so I think what people often think of as like a progressive wish list of policies in the Green New Deal is actually is actually about planning for a mass mobilization. I think the second part that makes it so different is we take very seriously the fact that this will be an economic transformation, right? When you change your energy source, you change everything, right? And climate change isn't even just because of energy. It's also about the ways that we think about growth in terms of this like consume, the ways that we use energy, all of that. And so the Green New Deal is just recognizes simply that to decarbonize at the pace and sort of the speed that we have to and at the scale that we have to, we are going to change our entire economy. And so if we're going to do that, why not transform it so that it includes the most people and that we end up with a healthier economy than we did before? And so that's also why you see a lot of the things related to justice that you see in the Green New Deal. And then I think there's just like really a very sort of simple third answer, which is that also this isn't a list of policy prescriptions. We approached it in terms of what kind of work needs to happen for us to decarbonize our economy. And so it's also very project focused in the sense that we're thinking about what work needs to be done, how do we create jobs, and sort of how do we use that job creation, this new moment in our economy, to renegotiate power relationships between the public and the private, between everyday folks and the elite, in ways that the majority of Americans are asking for.
And just so listeners know, what is the ultimate goal here with regard to reducing carbon emissions? What do we have to get done? Because, I've seen some people say, okay, we need net zero carbon emissions by 2050. I've heard, and then obviously in the Green New Deal resolution that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey put forward, they said, well, we're going to try to do net zero by 2030. What do you think, what has to happen in terms of reducing carbon emissions, and by when?
So the science says that we have about 10 to 12 years. There's some scientists now who say, like, we don't have any more time.
Mm-hmm.
We're on track to have sort of warming of 2 degrees. And so I think it's confusing because the 2050 number is about global emissions, right? And the U.S. is still the largest economy in the world, and so we contribute a ton of those emissions. And so for us to reach net zero by 2050, the U.S. will probably have to decrease. We'll have to decrease much more quickly than 2050 overall, in part because we play such an important role in sort of creating technologies, making them available to developing countries, and helping them decarbonize, which is going to be a huge part of this overall dealing with climate change. And so for us, I forget the exact targets. I think it was like in the IPCC report, I thought it was like 50% by 2030. I'd have to go back and look. I don't remember.
Okay.
But I think it's clear that we need to move before 2050. And I mean, right now it says if we hit 2 degrees of warming, like 99% of the coral reefs will be gone by 2040, right? And the human costs of fossil fuel pollution and climate change are already here, right? 66% of asthma deaths in the country are women. 3% of African Americans live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant, and black children, probably not coincidentally, die from asthma 3 times more than white children, right? 80% of Latinos live in an area with at least one air pollution violation, right? So how many people have, black lung because of coal mining, right? So there are already people whose bodies and lives are on the line, because of our reliance on fossil fuels, and that's not even talking about extreme weather events. And so I don't think we can move too quickly, right? Because we know that the devastation will increase. And so I think ASAP is really what the science seems to actually conclude.
So there's a lot of different ways to reduce carbon emissions, which of course has to be done across every industry, all kinds of different things. You can put a tax on carbon, you can put in place regulations, you can invest in clean energy. What made you select this specific set of policies, which, as you've described, sort of revolves around large-scale industrial mobilization?
Well, I think there's a couple things. The first is that mass mobilization is necessary to have the reductions that we need in the time frame if you're talking about 10 years, right? Just simply because there's too much work. You're talking about changing the grid. You're talking about decommissioning a bunch of old infrastructure. You're talking about building new renewables, and you're talking about upgrading all buildings so that you have more energy efficiency. And so there's just a ton of work that needs to be done if we are going to decarbonize our entire economy in a timely manner. And the other reason I think that we chose this is because these two issues, climate change and inequality, dovetail and create a particular synergy, not just because they're interconnected, right, in terms of greater inequality tends to lead to greater emissions, but just in the solutions, right? If you have all of this work that you need to be done, you're going to be creating a lot of jobs and a lot of need and a lot of demand. And then on sort of the income inequality side, there are studies that say we've done as much means testing, well, not as much, but we've had more means tested programs since the 1980s, and pre- and post-tax income are about the same, which means that transfers, like dealing with it through the tax code, isn't enough. So you have to intervene in the labor market, and so there's been so much talk about public employment programs and whatnot, but the issue is you don't want to just make work, you want it to be productive. And so you have these two things dovetailing so that you can have a strategy where you both decarbonize and you reduce income inequality. So we figured, why not take that opportunity? A lot of people talk about maybe that's too much, but to me that just sounds like efficiency.
Well, I was going to say, because people will say, all right, you've got these two crises. You got climate change and income inequality, right? But climate crisis is existential, so let's solve that first. Our political system is a shit show anyway. It can only bear so much. But to me, it seems like it's not only the right thing to do to also tackle income inequality, and we start there, it also seems like potentially a more politically pragmatic thing to do, because as you're trying to build consensus on how to transform the entire economy, obviously that's going to create winners and losers, and that could actually exacerbate income inequality as poorer families who have to bear the burden of the transition to the new energy economy, like what are they supposed to do? But if you can tell them, look, as we transition, you're going to have a guaranteed job, you're going to have a good wage, then maybe you're going to get support from both those people and the people who represent them in Congress. Is that basically the strategy?
100%. And I think it works on a couple levels. One, so I remember David Roberts was actually on this podcast, and he talks a lot about how power is necessary. We have to build power in the climate movement, largely because the GOP has just failed to move and it's so intransient.
Right.
And so you need a lot of public pressure to be pushing this issue and to be pushing it to the forefront, which I think the Green New Deal helps. And then the second thing is that it's also, besides just being right, it makes political sense. People of color are overwhelmingly in favor of climate change, but a lot of those same people cannot care about climate change or might not make it their first issue because they are so economically insecure and facing so many existential crises. I think I talked about this on Twitter before, but I think the existential crises argument is really tough because what constitutes an existential crisis depends on who you are and where you are and what other problems you face.
Yeah.
So climate change, if you are a black woman who's a single mother, right, whose kid has asthma, yeah, you wanna fix the environment because your kid has asthma, but you also have a precarious job, you don't have any savings potentially, right? Your child's school isn't that great, so you're worried about that. So climate change is falling far below. Now, if we can talk to people and connect climate change to the things that they care about, that is a huge potential block of climate voters that you just activated.
Right.
That might not have voted on that issue before.
So,
right? And so you're leaving them on the table. And also these are the same populations that, let's be honest, conservative groups, fossil fuel companies that don't want this to happen, those are the people that they're going to target talking about job loss, about economic loss, about what this transition is going to take away from them. So why don't we head them off before we give them the space to do that?
Yeah, it makes sense. So the other big issue from critics is, as you mentioned, financing. People say, okay, how are we going to finance this? Is it going to be higher taxes? And if it's not higher taxes, then, maybe it's true we've worried way too much about debt and deficits in the past. But if this is really going to be the cost of a World War-style mobilization, aren't we going to risk inflation at some point if we keep just financing it through, debt and deficit?
So I'm not an economist, but all the economists that I've talked to definitely agree that fear about inflation is overhyped, not only because we haven't met our inflation targets in years, not only because the rate of borrowing interest rates are low, but also because we have tools to deal with inflation, right? This is a problem that we know how to solve. Climate change is a problem. You can't argue with physics, but if you have, I guess I just don't understand. You can't argue with physics, but if you have, and we do have the tools to deal with inflation, then I don't understand quite why it's such a big worry.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if this country were under attack, like we were in one of the world wars, we wouldn't sit there and be like, well, we need a mass mobilization effort to fight the war, but first we have to figure out how to deficit finance it.
Exactly.
We probably just do it,
We're talking about coral reefs disappearing, right? Like not existing in 20 years. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of deaths. It's not millions of deaths. We're also talking about an economy that is already bleeding money because of climate change, and it's only going to get worse. There was a NASA study that just came out that was like $91 billion the U.S. economy lost just last year due to climate change. Like there is no reality in which climate change doesn't create a cost. The issue is, are you going to deal with that cost on the front end proactively and try to plan and create a better economy, or are you just going to deal with it when it's an emergency? Because you're going to deal with it, right? It's going to come with the price tag. You just need to decide when and where and how you want to spend your money.
So what's your most effective argument to skeptics and to people you're trying to mobilize around this issue?
I think one is like my personal story, which is that I came into this climate fight really recently, and that was largely because climate has seemed like such a white issue to me. Not that it only affected white people, but like I said, I was trying, like all of my work has dealt with equity and poverty and these intersectional solutions. And I'm trying to center marginalized people in the work that I do, right? How do we create a system that actually works for them, that gives them power instead of distributing the pain to them, right? That gives them resources instead of distributing violence to them. And when I'm talking to those folks, like I couldn't understand how I'm talking to I'm trying to write policy for a woman who's standing 2 days in line for public child care assistance, who like has a shift job. Her boss is calling her, threatening to fire her, but she can't even go to her job if her child care assistance isn't renewed, and she might not even make it to the front of that line after 2 days, right? And so how am I talking to her about solar panels? Right. Like what? I didn't understand the connections. But coming into this work, we did a lot of work on environmental justice at the Detroit Health Department, and then Abdul El-Sayed, who I was his policy director, is a huge advocate of environmental issues, especially from a public health perspective. And then understanding how the system worked, right? And also understanding the fact that, like, we can change this. This is human-made, and we have a lot of the technologies that we need. And so I try to explain that to people because I'm like, I've amassed an immense amount of social and political capital for a 29-year-old black woman especially, and for a 29-year-old in general. I have a Rhodes Scholarship. I'm educated. I should care about these things. And if I don't care until I understand how it fits in the system, you better believe that people who have a lot less time and a lot less money and, just a lot more sort of pressing issues to them are not going to connect with it either. But we need these people to lead this movement, because this idea that somehow we're just going to get there by trying to persuade GOP power brokers is just maddening to me. They haven't come along yet. I was actually just on a podcast where I heard that conservative white men are the least likely to be alarmed by climate change, right? And we're just ignoring all of these people who are suffering from these systems, and also who would move if they just understood. And so I find that that's really effective, because once you explain to people hey, I didn't start out in climate, because I think the other thing that we don't recognize is that there's quite a high bar to entering into the environmental space. It's a very science-heavy space, and often it feels like unless you are a particular activist, you can't speak unless you're a climate scientist.
Right.
And so I think lowering those barriers, talking about how much systems made a difference to me and now to the communities that I, talk to and work with, really helps.
Yeah, I do think it's about connecting the dots for people, right? Because you can already see, there's a whole bunch of people when you tell them, well, the coral reefs are going to disappear in 10 years. They might say, oh, well, that seems sad, but oh, well, that's not existential. And once you know what that means for coral reefs disappearing, then you're more alarmed. And look, and you're also alarmed when you start seeing when it's a drought on your farm, right? When it's a wildfire in your backyard, when your kids are suffering from asthma because there's a coal plant. And I do think we probably all have to work harder to connect the dots about why this is such an urgent crisis in people's lives right now, because otherwise you get people saying so wait, we have to do a bunch of stuff now for something that's way off in the future, or people are saying is off in the future 10 years. Do I really want to believe it? Do I really want to have a mass mobilization right now? And it seems like the big challenge here is helping people and making people understand, especially people in power, how urgent this is for people's lives right now.
Absolutely. And I think that, again, power building is part of that. I remember when I first came into this, the World War II mobilization example made sense to me, but I was always well, in order to get that sort of agreement amongst the people, you have to have everyone sort of agree, or at least most people agree, that this is an imminent threat that has to be moved on immediately, right? That's how you get the sort of very friendly Congress. That's how you get a friendly and willing public. And I feel right now, because the Green New Deal is helping to connect all these dots, that urgency is coming, right? And also, obviously, there's all of these other things, wildfires going on, right? There's constantly the polar vortex. 15 homeless people in Chicago froze to death.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like, this is not normal. And then the next week it was like 60 degrees. Like, people understand that this isn't normal, but doing that connecting work is so crucial.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're doing that work and all the work that you're doing on the Green New Deal and this movement to try to get people to pay attention. Really appreciate it, and thank you so much for joining us. I know you're very busy trying to save the planet.